So like organizing it in a way that if you need to go back to something that it's there, but make it very fast and manageable, because anyone can pull up faders. Anyone can put some EQ compression. It's very accessible, and it's awesome that it's very accessible. I love that. It's great for music. It's great for cool things. But taking it one step further is when it gets professional, you have to be able to move fast.
Huh. What's this red button do?
A restricted area. You may experience a phenomenon known as true recession. Let's rock.
Welcome back to The Record Process. Here we are, all assembled again. My beautiful, luscious, locked brethren, Mr. Adam Ackerman.
Hello.
And Mr. Tom Conran.
Hi.
How are we doing? How are the follicles treating you guys?
Today is a medium rare day.
Medium rare. It's humid up there.
Yeah, they're healthy. The humidity is definitely putting up a fight, but we're gonna win this fight.
Yeah, no, the battle's continuing to wage on for sure. You're looking great, and my hair's doing okay as well, I suppose. Thanks for asking, but it doesn't hold a candle to you guys. No, I'm glad you're doing well, and we're all feeling good. A very, very exciting day, because today, friends, is the day we've all been waiting for. We have walked our way through a significant discussion across multiple episodes of the process of conjuring up that kind of inspiration that we all long for as creatives, bringing it into song form, fleshing it out from a structural standpoint, from an instrumental standpoint, taking it into the pre-production wood shop, chopping it up and reassembling it all over again, and then executing it and affixing it in a tangible medium, whether analog or digital, through the recording process. And now, everyone's favorite. This is where Tom Conran's really going to take off, and we're going to try to not let it go on too long with some slippery slope tangents. But we're going to talk about getting into the mixing. And today is going to be part one. Much like recording, the first step is the one that's often overlooked. Would we not say that, gentlemen? And I know especially getting into this, and I'm sure Tom has plenty of stories, and I feel like we're just learning new stuff every day. We were just talking earlier about some ways that Tom's setup process has even come a long way, even recently. But it's the less sexy topic, but so crucial when it comes to later in the mixing process and really bringing out what you're capable of creatively. We're going to talk about setup and dealing with all the left brain stuff that, that's really important in terms of organizing everything to get all of our tracks that we've worked so hard to bring together and are already sitting in a really good place, we hope, and get those prepped for a great mix. So first off, we're going to start off by talking about how we get everything organized and prepped for a mix, and what ways we like to approach this. And I guess, Tom, I would love to just hand it off to you and say, first up, talk to me, because you're in the studio right now. I know as soon as this wraps, you're going to go back to mixing. I'm going to go back to prepping some stuff. Adam, you're constantly, as we've talked about multiple times along the way, in like a revolving carousel of multiple processes at once, with a lot of your pop stuff that you're doing, as well as, the honey jar stuff that we've worked on over the last couple years. So Tom, talk to us about like first steps when it comes to you get some tracks and organizing stuff.
So the first thing, just to get it out of the way, is make sure that all your tracks are there. There's countless times where I've received tracks from people that they're just, either they're not all there, they're not consolidated to the beginning, and they come in all out of order, not labeled. The biggest thing is, if you're sending them out to someone or if you're doing them yourself, do yourself a favor. Make sure that they're all there. Make sure that if you printed out some stuff, and for me, I really like this process of like, you cut everything, you edited everything, just consolidate it, open a new session, have a fresh session for mixing. Sometimes if you're a bit fast and loose with how you're taking it from that like recording process and editing process to the tracking process, sometimes things can get lost. So this would definitely be the stage where you can like gauge where your track organization, just from an archival standpoint, is going to come at.
Right. And this is and Tom, just jumping in there, that's so important, especially if up until now, everything, maybe even like pre-production, and then sometimes that becomes, a new session that you'll save a copy of it as, and you start tracking, the finals in that. And then you start to do some post-production all in the same session. You'll move around. We've talked about this before. You'll have recording groups engaged, but those maybe aren't the same parameters, as what you're going to want for mixing. And some of those can get confused. Some of those can get hidden. Some tracks deactivated, especially when you get like over 75, 100 tracks. And if you're not consolidating them down in groups already, like you would back in the days of tape, it forced you to do that. It can get easy to just lose something or have a track hidden. And then you're like, where'd this go when you send them out? Especially because mixing is a lot of times when you're passing off a session to somebody else, where this is the first time maybe in the whole process that you're handing them off to somebody that hasn't been there along for the ride, that doesn't know that one synth thing at the second pre-chorus should be there and won't know that it's missing, right? So that's a super good idea.
Case, that's perfect. The synth thing, second pre-chorus, cool. If it's not consolidated from the beginning of the track, or if it's not bounced down, right, and the synth just shows up in the intro, and there's no preface of like, hey, move this to bar 83 or something like that. That's also something that comes up if sometimes like you're working in like a loop-based format. Sometimes when you export tracks, it just goes to like just a loop, a bar. So like I've gotten sessions where they're like, here's the full track stems, and it's just 8 bars. And you're like, what?
Interesting choice. Really, really dug the loop. Shame it didn't go on for longer. I don't know. And that is like what you mentioned. It's like if something slides to the front, and they're like, that's a weird thing. It's kind of rubby. I don't know. I don't know. I guess I'll just bury it really, really low. I'm unsure, where totally. And that can all be avoided by consolidating and making sure before you send it, whatever folder you're sending it off, or if you're sending them a session, open it all up and listen to all the tracks and make sure they're all there. And also just make sure they're correct. Make sure they, if you printed them out, that they printed right, that there weren't any weird clicks, pops, or sometimes consolidating can also, if you have some edit points and some weird fades, you'll want to hear that, because as a mix engineer, they're going to start going nuts and be like, wait, what tracks that pop on? I've got 100 here that drop in.
And the just as a quick aside, what I've been doing lately is like, I've been making an archive in a Vault folder, because Pro Tools had some folder options and it's great. You can make them inactive. But in my brain, if I'm working on the same session as like a pre-production and all that fun stuff, in my brain, that's like archive. That's like stuff that I want to I don't ever need access to. And then the vault stuff is like if I have a consolidated track, these are the multi tracks of that. So it's
Right.
like stuff that I could go back to. So like organizing it in a way that if you need to go back to something that it's there, but make it very fast and manageable, because this whole thing is anyone can pull up faders. Anyone can put some EQ compression. It's very accessible, and it's awesome that it's very accessible. I love that. It's great for music. It's great for cool things. But taking it one step further is when it gets professional, you have to be able to move fast, and you have to be able to fly pretty fast.
Right.
So making it so that, oh, I love this guitar blend that you did with the, like, for example, if we had like a 57 and a 121, and I'm just
Classic
going
combo.
I'm just going to commit to the mix that we did. That way I don't have to think about that. Maybe I want to pull up the 121 a little bit more in the mix. Is that going to take me 2 minutes, or is that going to take me 15 minutes?
Right.
If I can organize it in a way that takes 2 minutes, great. I love that. That's cool. So this whole thing is about streamlining your process. It's about taking it from the loosely on the clock to being very on the clock.
Right.
And at least that's my mindset with all of this.
No, that's dude, Tom. That honestly, and that plays right into a lot of what we were discussing in terms of, naming stuff and organizing, which we're going to kind of get into here next. But I mean, it takes a lot of time and a lot of jumping through these process and working with other people, having conversations about like, oh, I do this, you should try this out. And even just, one of the reasons why, for as many issues as if you're, a part of the recording community or use Pro Tools, it's definitely a love-hate relationship with that DAW in many ways. But just the underlying playlist functionality, which we talked about when we talked about editing and consolidating tracks before moving into this mix stage. But that's also like a really easy thing to do, where if you have everything set up in that session, when you go to consolidate and you realize you missed an edit, you realize, hey, this guitar blend, I think it needs a little bit more weight, or it's I want to balance it a little bit better going into the mixing phase. Then all that underlying stuff is still there in that session, and it's a really quick boom, readjust, rebounce it out.
Yeah, I mean, like, and Adam, you can speak to this. Like, production's messy, man. I don't care how organized anyone thinks they are. If it's not messy, then I don't know. I feel like there's something. You're not being creative. That's my super hot take. For me, messiness is like, we have to be moving fast. I don't want to miss that moment, and sometimes that means maybe there's 4 instances of this synth track that really there only has to be one. But
yeah, and I don't know if I definitely mentioned this in an episode. I forget which one. It might have been in the tracking episode, or I might have even talked about this to you guys separately. But for me on the production end, I mean, like, I'm moving very, very quickly all the time. So I'm using like a bunch of shortcuts to make my life easier as just a producer, so that I can get tracks up and running and I can like chase that inspiration as fast as possible. And Tom, to your point, it does get messy from time to time. But I try to like do basic, routing of buses. I try to have like a drum bus and then a synth bus and a bass bus. And I try to make that just as I'm going, so that I have those like little bits of like mix organization for later. Because ultimately, like, I've done as of this week, I've done my first mix, which is crazy that I've actually sent out to get mastered.
Yes.
Shouts out to you guys for all your wisdom and all your guidance.
It's gonna sound great.
Very excited about it. But for the most part, my mixes are only to like show a client or shop to a label or something like that. It's not meant for release, and usually I call on my friends, particularly Tom, to mix it afterwards anyway. So a lot of the organizational stuff is more to help me like get it to the point where it is just palatable and digestible. And there some of the folks that I like learned a lot of things from on the production end. If I don't know if you guys know the band Disclosure, they're like an EDM duo. I think they're amazing. They've been doing an amazing Twitch series where they literally take their songs track by track and they will like break down everything. They will show you every parameter on every plugin. They will show you every sample they've used. It's really informative stuff. Definitely check it out on their YouTube.
We'll link to that
or go
in the
check
show
out their
notes.
Twitch channel.
Yeah.
But they have an amazing template which is already pre-routed for them. So when they're doing a production, they open it up, and now mind you, like I believe one of the more like engineer brained one, his name is Guy, and
Classic Guy,
right? And he's like, he's got like a pretty like maxed out like MacBook Pro or something like that. So his computer can handle this heavy lifting of synths and everything. But he's got like every synth already preloaded. He's got it all pre-routed. He's got his filters like ready to go. He's got his automation lanes set up the way that he likes them. And now whenever he goes to do a track, like everything is already there, like set up for him, ready to go. He can just drop samples in. He can just start playing MIDI. And he has everything already routed in such a way it's all color coded, which like that's also something that I try to do, especially when I get towards like the end of a song. Try to like group everything, especially because I work within Logic. So I'll do like a track stack. And then once everything is in that stack, I'll color code it all the same. That way there is like some sort of just like easy visual representation of the grouping. That has been super helpful. So, I mean, there are just like little quick things like that can be the difference between you like losing a track in the session, or even something as simple as like when I get drums from my co-writer, like immediately the first thing that I do is I organize it like top down, like kick, snare, hi-hats, and I just like, I do it in the same way every time. That way I just know intrinsically, like, okay, if I need to find the kick, I know roughly where it is. I try to always put the bass next to the kick because I'm always working on them side by side.
Yeah, and the like, let me preface my last comment of it has to be messy. It doesn't have to be messy if you set it up. If you go into it as like, I'm gonna make a song and have no organization, then it's going to get messy, and that's also okay. I also want to preface
messy,
and
like that's for like I like especially when I'm tracking like something fresh, because I personally don't have a template yet. Like I don't open up a session and there's already tracks in place. I open up a blank session every time I'm writing something because I don't know what I'm going to do that day. I'm doing all sorts of genres. I'm doing all sorts of like different styles and song types. So there was no real like good template for me to use yet, and I think probably now I could make one that would get me through. But no, it always starts messy because I'm just opening up tracks and like as things are moving, like I'm trying my best to keep it organized, but something always falls through the cracks. And then as I'm mixing, I'm like, what the hell is that one thing? Just trying to like get it balanced at the end of like an 8-hour like writing day. And I'm like, what the hell is that thing? And then I go back and I finally find it. And it's like, oh, that guitar somehow got routed through the drum bus. So now it's getting all the like parallel drum processing that I'm doing on it. So it just sounds crazy.
Yeah. I really like that one, that one time that we were writing together, Adam. There's like a I think the track was called Golden Eagle, and it was hidden, and like we were like cruising through, and it was like 20 dB louder than the rest of the track, and it only happened at one instance, and it was like caca!
Yeah, amazing.
And
and sometimes you can have some cool accidents with that shit.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know.
This was not a cool accident.
No, but
this was a very scary 5
This sounds
minutes.
horrifying what you're describing, but I don't know, like a guitar with like heavy like parallel drum processing, maybe that gives you an idea for something else. So sometimes the fact that it's messy can lend itself to some weird, cool things, or even something accidentally gets muted or turned way up, and it gives you a completely different perspective on it. That's cool, and then you can print that down or make a note of it and remember come mix time. But ultimately, what you're describing and what a lot of, like independent, career composer and songwriter do is they write and then ultimately lay things out with the end in mind so that they can give a static balance like pretty quickly. So it's like a 20-minute thing at the end of the day and not like a 3-hour thing trying to go track by track and sort everything, as well as saving some time from a mix standpoint if you're trying to do it all, take it on start to finish and send actual mixes out the door. We'll get down to this, and I'll actually link to this in the show notes too, but Tom and I have had some conversations about I think it's a new book, actually Billy Decker, like a Nashville guy, big time like pop mix engineer, has done a ton of radio shit. I'm sure anybody out there, even if you're not a fan of some of the genres, you've definitely heard some Decker mixes if you've listened to the radio in the last couple years. But because he deals with so many of the same Nashville producers and Nashville engineers and a lot of those studios, he has templates for all of those guys. So he knows exactly if it's coming from this room and this guy engineered it, this is how his tracks are laid out. And all I have to do is drop them into my template for X producer, X artist, X whatever. And he's already like 85-90% of the way there. It's actually kind of insane watching him do it. This doesn't work for everybody, but it works in the sense of just like you, if you're always getting drums from a co-writer, then you have a template where, okay, it might not be exact because every song is going to be a little different and require some different sounds and different level balancing. But if it's coming from the same DAW and using a similar sample pack, or at least the foundational elements are similar, or they bounce them out at the same level, then that's a great starting point, and that's a time saver, especially if, that means that everything gets situated the way you like to treat it in the end, and you're working off of that from an informed balance perspective too. So that's great, and that's...
Yeah, and I mean, like, to go on that case, like, just to, like, I guess move this along, like going in, I think the name of the game is knowing what you're going into, knowing how things are set up, knowing how things are going to react to what you put in. So like starting by like understanding gain staging is also like a huge thing. And that's kind of that, like, is kind of we'll get into that a little bit later, but understanding where your samples sit. Like, I know there's some sample packs that make them mix ready, so they're limited. You pop them in, and like everything's like blowing your system out, and some are like, this is what you would record, and it's kind of that kind of vibe. There's positives and negatives to both, and again, it's just like knowing what you want, you as a mixer, how you set your stuff up so that you can have something that's manageable every single time.
Right.
And for me, I'm a big VU guy. I love VUs. And I'm not sure about Logic, but I know in Pro Tools they recently updated so that all versions of Pro Tools have the option for a VU meter for the metering. And for myself, I try and sit around like what I would expect on a VU meter. So like dancing around 0 and so on and so forth. Sometimes it like depending on the source material, some of the transient stuff, it's going to be a little bit lower and it kind of gets a little hairy. But that's what I'm calibrating my system to, so that when I pop in a track from that I've tracked with UCase, cool, where I'm going to make sure that my kicks are all hitting at that 0 VU and my bass is hitting at the 0 VU, because that's what my template's calibrated for. And that even means that if Adam's throwing me like some very processed samples, I'm going to duck those down to hit that same 0 VU, so I know that my system is still going to work no matter the genre. And that's a big thing with, and like figuring out what works best for you is important in that regard, because like some people are like, fuck VUs, like I'm going to use -8 LUFS, so full -8 dB full scale, not LUFS. I'm going to use this as like where everything's going to hit, and then I get that. Cool, that's great, awesome. As long as there's a process and a method to the madness, that's the most important part.
Yes, 100%. And we'll, for anybody that like, so throwing around like VU versus LUFS, DB full scale stuff, we'll maybe link to something in the show notes that kind of describes the difference inherently between them. Because like you said, you can switch the metering within your DAW or use different plugins, and just because that's something that's not always the most intuitive, especially if you just start out with GarageBand Logic and you're just like, the meter goes this high and stops at this, and but sometimes the understanding the different metering, especially even like peak metering versus RMS, that kind of stuff, I think is really important. So we'll make sure to link to. We'll find something that throws like a decent description of all of that, and I'll put that in the show notes if some of this is confusing, because there's a lot to get to and understand when it comes to that. And it really is. It's another thing that I think I definitely early on skipped, and I was like, who cares? It's if I push the fader up, it goes louder, and push it goes down. I just don't want to hit red, right? But understanding further down the line when you're trying to do something consistently and get a similar result, especially when we talk about stuff like templates, they're only as effective as how you manage what you're putting in and how you're, and what you're giving it and what you're, intuitively placing into the template and how you're gain staging it. So for sure. So I'm glad you brought that up, and I'll make sure we link to that. But like, so the first thing, aside from like gain staging, because we'll talk more in detail about routing in a second. But the biggest thing, so shifting gears, if say you're putting on specifically your mix engineer hat, and for the sake of an example, let's say you're mixing something that's not your track, that you didn't do, you're just getting tracks, right? So the organizational process behind that when you first get tracks in, right, making sure that the name schemes and organization, Adam, you talked visually, color coding stuff, super effective for quick, top to bottom scrolling in your DAW, so you can easily see where it's at. But Tom, I know your template and mine and a lot of stuff that I do deal with 3 things very specifically that I want to touch on and mention. One being VCAs, the second being aux faders, and the third being groupings and or like subgroupings. So I would love to be, and especially too, we brought this up and we always kind of talk about it, but it is kind of an origin, and I've grown to like the nomenclature and naming scheme that Craig Bauer, mix engineer, uses. And I'd love you to talk a little bit about that, and maybe we'll real quick do the difference between the 3 of them and how they can be used to lay out, a mix really efficiently so that you can get a real quick static balance, because that's going to be the next the part 2, the next phase of mixing. So
Yeah, so like I guess let's start at the bottom. So a group, and so with grouping, it just groups 2 tracks. You can do this in Logic, you can do this in Pro Tools, you can do this in every DAW. Links 2 tracks, you can control how much or how little it actually groups the 2 tracks. So like whether it's down to a plug-in scale, down to a send scale, there's a whole bunch of different parameters that you can control there.
Something as simple as you grab one fader and all the faders in that group, adjust from a volume down to, we were talking about this, multiple, like the depth that you can go with it in terms of, okay, when we're editing, you group an entire kit together once it's locked and phase locked and everything, and so then you're chopping and moving everything together, so you don't mess with the phase, or
and you can make ones that are specific to just editing. Right. You can make ones specific just mixing, and so a whole bunch of awesome stuff. But so that's that. So groups, they're linking tracks and they're writing. If you write automation, most of the time they're going to do it together.
Yeah. So talking specifically about the mix groups in this case, then
Now the next one would be like a VCA, which is a voltage control amplifier. In this case, if we're talking about DAWs, they're digitally controlled amplifiers, or what we can get into the origin, or we can link to show notes on like what the difference is. But for the sake of just moving on, VCAs are going to control a large swath of tracks in almost a similar manner as groups, but on just on a volume scale. So, for example, if I like to think of it as like the meta fader. So like we have our fader, we're doing some like cool rides, and then we have we're like, oh man, I made all these cool rides on this group, and it's really cool, but now I just want to pull down the track, just like the whole track just can come down a couple dB. Or for example, if you're like getting really into the mix, you're at the final stage and you're like, I clearly was monitoring too loud and my vocals are like 3 dB too loud. The VCA, you can go in, and as long as you have it assigned appropriately, bring that down, do large scale moves without any automation, without it affecting the automation, which is huge.
Right.
And that's all it does. It only controls that. It's not, audio's not routing through it in the digital, in the DCA world, in your DAW. Audio is not routing through it. It's just a big old fader that's controlling whatever it's assigned to. So that's a huge, awesome tool to use. Then the last one is an aux, or aux bus. There's a bunch of different terms that people throw around. For the sake of this, we're going to call it an aux. We'll keep it there.
Short for auxiliary, right?
Yeah, thank you. And so that's going to take, say we have those same guitar tracks, or I don't know if I said guitar before, but say we have guitar tracks that we grouped and we have a VCA on them. Cool. We're using two of our terms already. Let's say we route them into an aux. Now, the aux will allow us to process things so it's processing the guitar through this channel, so we can add in plugins and do a giant, big old like EQ move, but it's going to affect everything that's routed through it, or compression move, or
one plugin versus doing that same EQ move on all 4 rhythm guitar, whatever it might be. Right.
And when you start dealing with dynamic stuff, though, it tends, you have to be wary of what you're feeding into the aux, because it's all based off of what it's being fed.
Right.
So
which is why the VCA movement comes into play, because if you have a compressor set for, we'll run with like a vocal bus, right? You've got some like a compression glue on your all vocal bus, right? But if you decide, hey, my vocals are a little too loud, but you grab the vocal VCA, you're gonna bring down what you're feeding to that compressor. So all of a sudden you're affecting how that compressor's reacting, or maybe all of a sudden you're not hitting the threshold in the same way. So you're gonna, it's good to know which to grab in which instance. You have multiple levels of control.
And that as a little tangent, that kind of gets me to the like, you hear like the biggest thing that you see like in like mixing things online of like learn how to mix, all this kind of stuff, is there's a good bundle of them saying like food group processing. And what that means is like you have your drums and you have a compressor on the drums on an aux channel. So it's awesome. Love that. Cool. But you have to understand the implications. And like Casey was saying, let's say we want to make the kick a little bit louder or the snare a little bit quieter. If we're processing everything through that compressor that's now on the drum bus or the drum aux, it's going to change what it sounds like if we make any volume moves. So it handicaps. So where, like, just knowing the implications of using each, like the VCA, the group, the aux, they all have strengths and they all have really, really good uses, but they also have handicaps if you use them, not inappropriately, but if you use them in a way that there's implications to using it that way.
Right.
So like personally, I prefer like parallel processing on the drums and using a post fader send from the drums to a parallel processor, or doing something of the sort before it hits the overall drum bus. That way I have full control of everything. I'm not worried that, oh man, if I want to automate the kick drum, it's going to change the whole tone of my kit. I don't want that. I want the kick drum to be the kick drum, always be the kick drum. If I have to move it down a couple dB for a section or move it up, I don't want that to change how it feels. Or if I do, I have to know that.
Right. And there is a whole science behind like mixing into compression and limiters. And a lot of guys swear by that stuff. And you'll find YouTube videos that'll be like, don't never like take limiters off your mix bus. Don't do that. Like it's wrong. And then there are guys that are just like, that's how I get my sound. Like that is like, people are like, well, if you take the limiter off and your mix falls apart, it's like, yeah, but I just don't take the limiter off because that's just the sound I want. Right.
And that totally works. Again, it's just about like knowing where your tracks are coming from,
right,
knowing how you work, and knowing what, like, if you're like a specific genre, then yeah, keep it on all the time. You got this. But like if I, like, for example, like I'm moving from a indie rock project today to a metal project to a post-hardcore project to electronic.
Right.
I need that template to work on all genres. And so for me, I adapted my workflow to be like to
Really
work in
malleable
that.
and flexible,
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. So like
And other guys might have their metal template, their pop punk template,
Exactly.
their indie rock template, their EDM template, and they're all routed and subbed according to what they know they're going to want out of it and want to do, right? So if it's metal, it's like, you're going to be squashing the living shit out of those shells in like parallel, or just limiting to high hell on that like snare kit, whatever it is. Like, so then they'll probably build all of that in there because they're not worried about over processing at that level, because they know that's how they want to get that sound, right? Whereas other guys, you might want something that's much cleaner so that you avoid a lot of that over processing and artifacts that you get from like compression on compression kind of stuff. But yeah, so subgroups specifically, and talking about drums, because drum mixing, and we'll get into this in future episodes with the rest of the series, but I feel like it's this like mysterious, like dark art of everybody has their own, just because there's so much going on within one instrument of a drum kit, right? As a whole, but processing it, the mixing is where you're actually bringing a whole set of many pieces and trying to make it feel like one cohesive instrument. But the subgroup stuff, where you have multiple mics on a kick drum, multiple mics on a snare drum, right? And subgrouping those out, being able to process all of the kick mics as your one kick drum, and then things like that, or even grouping them. They're probably already grouped from the recording stage, but maybe grouping them in a way where, like you mentioned, if you're putting up a virtual console plugin across your entire every track on your drum bus, that if you make an adjustment on something, you want to make sure, like, hey, like, do you want that adjustment to go for all of the tracks at once, right?
Yeah, like specifically on that case, like I had this like hip hop session that I was working on, and we just wanted the drums a little bit crispier, and like the sound of the early 90s hip hop drums is like a crispy SSL. And so it was very easy to to listen by grouping all of the drums, gaining them up with in this case it was the Focusrite console plugin by Brainworks, gaining it up on the input, putting the output down, and it moved all the tracks. If I didn't group it and went through each of the 20 drum tracks that we had,
right,
that's minutes that I'm now spending for a 5-second move.
And that is an incredibly great point in terms of why we're talking about all of this setup stuff, which sure can be like tedious and be like, yeah, I get it. Like, color code them, label your shit. Like, let me start moving faders and throwing plugins on and stuff. But it's so important and imperative, because when you get to, if you're actually doing this, whether it's just your own music as a hobby, whatever, but like what you're inevitably going to do is you're going to bounce out that first rough mix, and you're going to go listen to it in the car and be like, oh God, this is fucking awful. I have 1,000 fucking notes. And then you're gonna go into recall mode. Or if it's a client, you send something out the door and they're like, hey man, it sounds pretty cool, but like, could I have the snare up like 2 dB, and also the bass is just a little bit too boomy or whatever. It's like, then by routing everything in this way, it makes those recall moves at every possible level. You have control, and all you have to do is select, hey, I'm going to check in, and you know what? This is actually an easy one, because I can just take the whole snare subgroup and just push it up 2 dB. Done. Yeah. And then in one move, it brings up, maybe you have 2 mics on the top head, another bottom snare mic on there, and you have like a bunch of, different plugins on each one that are doing different things. Boom, you were able to just with one fader adjust all of that, and then there it is, right? Or maybe if with the bass thing, it's okay, it's too boomy. Well, I have maybe you split, you know, in terms of like processing, maybe you take your bass and split it into like a low end and top end to even it out. Maybe it's like the performance wasn't super coherent and balanced. It's like, then all of a sudden, all you have to do is just like, okay, great. Well, I'm just the subs on the bass, I can just turn those down. Or, hey, it's just this one part. Well, guess what? I have an auxiliary that I'm running all of my bass stuff through, or all of my drums through. Now I can just go and make a little automation move on that aux track and I don't have to like go in and do everything at a sub level, which is what a lot of people start to refer to as like top down mixing, where if you're you mentioned food group stuff, you know, bussing everything out and then making broader stroke stuff, to the whole groups instead of getting in there and trying to notch every little thing out, can sometimes work. But again, it depends on the genre, and everybody has their own way, and you find out what you like, what works for you, and what's really fast. But knowing and understanding how to route things to give you that control and to give you those levels of experimentation is super important for the creative onslaught that comes after.
And one last thing on like the prepping and the organization is that, like, for me, I like to give my clients archival stems.
Yes,
as everyone ideally should. Or at least offer. I have in my template that everything's already routed. I have my all my stem tracks like inactive, and then when we finalize the mix, cool, it's one click, and now I have all the stems, and it's bounced down. They're consolidated. I don't have to worry about them. And whereas before you're like, man, I need to spend an hour rerouting so I can get all of my things in line. So I have these stems.
And I've done it. I've spent the extra couple hours just to be like, cool, here's this, like, here are the background harmonies that don't sound like trash.
If either you don't account for that in your mixing rate, or maybe you just got comfy cozy with the band and they're like, oh man, can you just do it? Now that's time that like is wasted for you. And again, if I can save an hour or two, that's an hour or two I can put towards another project. Right.
And this is what we're talking about when we get into the conversation of starting a static mix and having a workflow to be able to do this and have repeated success with it, and ultimately shave down the amount of time that you have to think or try things and knowing things. And it's so important. It's taken years, and I still feel like every day I wake up and I'm like, man, there's a better way to do this, I think. And stuff changes based on what you're doing and how I've changed my process, and the way I process bass, the way I like treat a kick drum, the way, you know what I mean? Like, I'm always trying, which I think is also really important for setting yourself up with this. It gives you a lot of control to go try new things, and not be afraid of that. By, hey, let me try a different compressor on this group, right? Let me try a different EQ, a different like saturation plugin or whatever it is, or even just like having everything routed up. We didn't even talk about like effects sends and like auxiliary like channels. But that's a really easy thing to be like, hey, I want to try this different reverb. Well, you have all of your stuff sent to this vocal reverb bus instead of just putting reverb plugins on the tracks, in which you can do, but it'll A, get really processing intensive, and B, then if you're like, hey, I wonder what this different reverb sounds like on these vocals. Well, if you had everything bust out, you can just switch the reverb on that aux and then know exactly how that sounds, whereas if it's on every track, it's a little bit tougher.
It becomes a whole thing. But before we move on, I want to go through the different types of routing, and we kind of touched on it before, but so we have our auxiliary tracks, also known as bus tracks, also known as aux tracks. We have our control amplifiers, whether they're VCAs or DCAs. That kind of depends on your system. For the most part, they're virtual VCAs. In most DAWs, we also have a master fader. Whether you can access that depends on your DAW. In Pro Tools, you can make master faders. There's implications for master faders. I know in Pro Tools, or at least the last time I checked, the master fader in Pro Tools is 24-bit. If you're working in a 32-bit float session, the master fader is 24-bit. So if you clip it, then you hear it. I'm not sure if they changed that or if that has been changed for a while. That's how I start, like back in Pro Tools Empowered or 7. That's how it was. So I've been operating on that that idea for the last little bit. And then we go down the list, and we're thinking about subgroups and groups. Subgroups being either a collection of tracks grouped together, or it could be a collection of tracks, like multiple mics grouped into one aux.
Right. Multiple mics on a guitar amp, multiple mics on one drum. Yeah.
Yeah. And so whether or not they're routed or not, the idea is like, if it's one instrument, or if it's like the rule of thumb I use is like, if it's a mono instrument, so a guitar or a bass, for the most part, it's one source. It's a mono source. It's a pretty good rule of thumb. You can experiment with that, but the last type of routing is parallel. So we like briefly talked about it before, but parallel is you have a track that's dry. Think of it as dry wet knob.
Dry wet, yes. The blend knob. You'll see this on a lot of plugins nowadays too. A lot of guitar pedals, effects pedals have it. I love it. It's such a cool mix feature.
Yeah, and when you have a plugin that has dry wet. Cool. That's great. You can do the same thing with a parallel auxiliary channel as well. You have a bit more control at shaping it to how you want it to be, as well as detailed control of it in the mix. So it's not wrong to use a thing that has a dry wet knob and you're like, it works. I set it to 50% dry wet. Great. Awesome. It's, if you want the creative flexibility, then put it on a parallel, set it to 100% wet, and then bring it in, and that's your dry wet balance. But now you can EQ before it, you can EQ after it, you can compress it, you can send it to another reverb. There's Adam, you were doing it the other day, where say you wanted a bit of pre-delay on your reverb. You can either put a delay before the reverb, or if you want to get kooky with it, you could you can say you have a vocal and you have this reverb, and the reverb's being used for all the vocals, but you want the lead vocal to be a little bit farther back in the room. Or let's say the background vocals, you want to be a little farther back. You send them to a delay, a delay aux, and then send that aux into the reverb. Now you have this wild ability to push and pull those background vocals further or closer in time because it has the delay. Now that's like the light version of parallel processing. The heavier version, you can do, you hear about like parallel compression, and that allows you to have all the weight of your compressors, but all the attack of the dry signal. So, and that's a cool thing that
very common, especially
Yeah.
a lot of like rock stuff. Just get a thicker drum sound without losing the punch of a lot of those natural transients. I love it. Even Tom, we've talked at like a drum dirt bus, or just like adding distortion and some gnarly stuff. Even we're talking about like, committing to like some gnarly bass distortion. And I have a pretty serious problem with my relationship with SansAmp and Drive when I'm tracking bass, and I love to just commit to that. I obviously capture a clean DI as well, but effectively then I have both of those signals, and that blending is a similar thing that we're talking about in terms of if you take a drum bus and send those shells or that whole kit to a parallel bus and carve out like a wild smiley face EQ and then annihilate it with like a distortion plugin. You wouldn't be able to do that if it was just a wet dry balance on the drum bus. You can effectively say, hey, this is cool. I love the distortion, and the character that it brings, but it just crazy spikes, like some really piercing high-end stuff. So if I can just EQ that out or cut it, and then when I blend it back in, I get everything I want out of it, which you wouldn't be able to do if you were just using, the wet dry of a plugin on a bus. So I always love those kind of uses. And I think that's like and the sky's the limit from a creativity standpoint in terms of whether you're delaying stuff and pushing things spatially with time or whatever it is, but, or just pitch and every way that you can affect stuff, that you leave the existing dry signal, and it gives you a lot of experimentation with parallel, grouping or sending,
Tom, I sorry to backtrack here, but I want to go back to this master routing, because you've definitely explained it to me on multiple occasions. I should know by now, but can you explain the difference between the master fader versus like a DCA or VCA or an aux? Because I don't quite understand what the delineation of like when you would use a master fader versus either of those other two.
Yeah. So again, I'm going to speak to Pro Tools specific. I believe Logic follows the same rule, but I believe the whole industry follows the same rules, but I may be wrong. I'm majority of the time I'm wrong, but
incorrect. You are wrong in that statement. And that statement alone.
Hey. But so we'll start with an aux fader. So an aux, we're routing stuff through it. If we think of it as a signal chain, it's our source into our aux through the plugins and then the fader. So the fader is the last thing. With a master fader, again in Pro Tools, the fader controls, it goes source, fader, then plugins. So if the great thing that I like to tell people is, like, we're doing a fade out on a song. There's two different ways for this to happen. Either if we are fading out if we fade out with an aux channel, everything's going into our processing. So let's say we have a whole bunch of dynamic processors. It's going through a limiter, cool, awesome, and we have the same mix, and that's fading down, and it's just dropping in level. Now, if we use a master fader, though, we have our source, it's going through the fader into all of our dynamic processing. So we will get a unique result as the fade starts going down. It's going to start going through our dynamic processing at a lower and lower level. So it often fades like that often will sound different with the two different types of faders, even though they're doing the same exact thing.
Right. So it's an order of operations thing, which is again too with like a master fader, specifically in Pro Tools. You can almost think of it as the as quite literally, if you're listening back to something on the radio, if there are no other additional like processing after the radio, it's just straight up the volume knob. The song from a station is coming in at the same volume, same sound, whatever, but you're just actually attenuating it down unless there's processing afterwards, which is why a lot of times, and I know you use this, Tom, but I've gotten into like a sub bus, essentially a mix bus, where a lot of that processing is done before the master fader, and then keeping the master fader as just solely your fader ride for the fade in and outs. Yeah,
and so there's that, and then as far as a VCA, that doesn't pass audio at all. That's just controlling. So it's if we have 30 different drum tracks and we want all of them to be quieter, just it goes down. And say they can be grouped separately, they can be doing all this automation. A VCA disregards all of that and just brings it all down.
I always loved when I was like learning all this stuff early on. I love if you kind of track everything back to an analog, like a big old mix console, say a big SSL Neve or whatever. And I think the way it was explained to me early on was almost like, so if you're real time printing a mix down to tape, you got to grab all the faders. Say you want it long ago, before the VCA stuff, where you could link a bunch of faders together to one VCA fader. It's almost like taking a ruler and, hey, I want these like 10 tracks to all go down at the same time, at the same speed. Putting a ruler on top of all the faders and just pulling that ruler down. But instead of the ruler, it's now assigned to just one fader that kind of manhandles all of those faders at once. So it allows them, you can have a submix of all the drums, different fader levels, and it'll preserve that relationship and just effectively freeze all of them and pull them down, pull them up with one fader.
And for anyone who's dealt with live sound, you typically see a section in the middle of the console that is like, I'm going to call it like your control center. That section is typically called like the spill channel.
Yeah.
So that's where everything comes in, and you have 8 faders, and that controls the entire mix. So you have like drums, bass, guitar, vocals, background vocals, et cetera, et cetera. And that's a way that you can make a show that has 200 mics on stage for these big shows very manageable, very easy to mix, very easy to go through and do a 2-second change and affect a lot without you getting derailed of like, oh, where's this track? Oh, it's all the way down here, and like going through menus or literally running across the room. And that same mindset is something that at least for me, I've applied to my mix, like my mixes, my templates. They're very spill based. So I'm I'll be getting the ideas of everything throughout, and then I want to knock it down to as little faders as possible that I can do big automation moves and be able to creatively not think of like, oh, what's the EQ on the kick drum doesn't feel good now. I want to be able to not think about that, put that off in a different section and see like, how does the drums make me feel if I push the kick drum up a little bit or push it down. I want to take that left brain stuff and put it away. And so that's the nice thing that you get from the spill tracks is you can kind of put it in the vault, put it away, and just focus on the creative aspects of it.
Right, and which honestly is kind of the perfect segue to what will be the part 2, which is talking about getting a static mix together. So if we've done all of this correctly, organized all of this stuff, and put these tracks, labeling, routing, grouping into a familiar format that we are used to and can handle very quickly and efficiently, then we should be ready to go with the first foundational step of exactly what you just described, Tom. And that's what we're going to get into on next week's episode, talking about a foundational static mix where you're using those VCAs and real quick, my drum bus up a dB and getting that volume balance relationship feeling really nice pretty quickly, so you're not, getting hung up on that vocal needs to be brightened a little bit.
Yeah.
That guitar, there's a little harshness in the mid-range, whatever it is. We're just getting the best possible relationship to work out of, where we can then go in and kind of carve out everything and really, start to bring all of those elements to life, because we know the balance is sitting in a really decent cohesive place already. So yeah, that's a perfect way to leave it for this week. I mean, we covered a ton of stuff, but I hope everybody got a lot out of it. And I'll link to a bunch of those things that we mentioned in the show notes, some of the differentiation between VU, dB full scale, and a little bit better description of some of the VCA, DCA, and master stuff. Just because, Adam, you brought that up, and that has always been a common thing that I think is not always put out there or understood as much as I think it could be. So hopefully that will help some people out, and that'll be able to be used as a good resource. But until next week, go get everything organized and get routed, and get ready to ditch all the left brain stuff and fly right into that right brain stuff next week when we start to put together a static mix and talk about that. So thanks again, everybody, and we will catch you next time. Everyone, thanks again for following along with the record process and joining us on this first episode of our multi-part series all about mixing. This has been one that we've really been waiting for, so we're excited to hear some feedback, see what you guys think. Hopefully you get a lot out of it. I know we really enjoy putting these together, and specifically this series about mixing is going to have a lot of in-depth content, so stay tuned. Next week we're going to get into talking about putting together a static mix, the importance of utilizing the 80-20 rule in doing that, making micro versus macro decisions when you're constructing this initial foundation, and having a vision for the overall track that you're trying to bring to life before you actually start moving faders and throwing plugins on. So stick with us, don't go anywhere, and as always, you can follow along at The Record Process on Instagram, or you can follow us and like us on Facebook at True Level Studio. And as always, if you want to reach out to us by email with any questions or feedback, you can hit us at truelevelstudio@gmail.com. And we'll see you for part 2 of our mixing series next week on
The Record Process.